Hey, this is the Bible Forum, and I'm Warren Sprouse. We're here every Sunday night just for you from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Time, looking at life through a biblical lens and solving all the world's problems in 2 hours or less. Got a rundown of some events that have taken place this week. I've entitled this, What in the World? You know, Fidel Castro died, right? He's dead. His body's been burned. The ashes have been placed in a container. The container is being transported all throughout Cuba with citizens who are required to appear along the route and offer an enthusiastic due respect. We saw flags in Havana were being flown at half-mast, all the world's flags except Old Glory. Our flag did not come down. I don't know if that was something they did to make a point or whether they just didn't get the memo. The vast majority of nations have no idea how to respond to this death. Fidel was not a nice man. His legacy is in chaos. Nobody's quite certain how close they want to be when it all comes unglued, and it's likely to do just that. But sooner or later, the truth is going to be available, and it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. Inquiring minds want to know, well, what about his estate? You say, well, I didn't know he had an estate. Castro has always claimed that his salary was set at the equivalent of about $43 a month as supreme leader. But one of his bodyguards, a man by the name of Juan Reynaldo Sanchez, has written a memoir detailing Castro's secret life. And he says about Castro that at his death, his estate was valued at more than $900 million. You try to get that much money. I don't know how old you have to be at $43 a month to get that much money. But that's what he says it's worth. And where he lived, with its orange, lemon, mandarin, grapefruit, and banana trees, he says resembled a veritable Garden of Eden. Now, it's reported that Castro actually owns 3 additional residences. One is just a stone's throw from the Bay of Pigs. One features a private marina. One is a chalet. One of his estates comes replete with a rooftop bowling alley and an indoor basketball court, as well as a coastal villa next to a private marina with a pool, a jacuzzi, and a sauna. All this while Cuban citizens have been traveling around in 1950s era cars for the last 50 years. Oh, all of which, by the way, are owned by the state. Did you know that? I think just recently, with all that's been going on relative to opening the doors and so forth, that changed. But all those cars were owned by the state. So how does a man making $43 a month accumulate all of this wealth? Well, Sanchez's book seems to reveal the answer. He says, quote, very simply, a huge drug trafficking transaction was being carried out at the highest echelons of the state. Apparently, the leader of the free world was not aware of this. He never mentioned it. It's also not clear who's going to get Castro's fortune. He has 2 living siblings, one of whom is acting as Cuba's leader currently, and he has 9 children, at least one of which abandoned Cuba decades ago. A daughter came to this country and said he was a monster. We'll see how all this plays out. There was one of those interesting things happened this past week that is weird, crude, not nice, and yet fascinating at the same time. The Donald has appointed a Secretary of Defense. His name is euphemistically referred to as Mad Dog Mattis. And in the appointment of this man, he hasn't been confirmed yet, but he will. The whole issue of waterboarding came up. Mad Dog is probably one of the most significant military guys of our era. One of the fellows, a Marine pilot who served under him, wrote a book, and there was an article that was taken from this book. The book is called The Strategy Brigade. And he writes, America knows General James Mattis as a character, Mad Dog Mattis, the font of many funny jokes and Chuck Norris caliber memes. Those of us who served with him, however, know that he is a caring, erudite, war-fighting general. We also know that there is a reason he uses the call sign Chaos. He is a lifelong student of his profession, a devotee of maneuver warfare and of Sun Tzu, the sort of guy who wants to win without fighting, to cause chaos among those he would oppose. To Marines, he is the finest of our tribal leaders. The rest of the world very soon will know how truly gifted he is. Our friends and allies will be happy that he is our new Secretary of War. Our enemies will soon wish he were not. This author says, I worked for Mattis 3 times when he was a colonel, a major general, and a lieutenant general. I very much want to work for him again, and here's why. In July 1994, he says, I checked into 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines in 29 Palms, California. It was 125 degrees in July in the high desert. Everyone was in the field. This was a hard place for hard men training for the hardest of jobs. Then Colonel Mattis, the 7th Marine Regimental Commander, called me to come see him. I was not only just a brand new captain, but an aviator in an infantry regiment. I was a minor light in the 7th Marine firmament. I was not in any measure a key player. I arrived early. Captains do that when they're reporting, and waited in the anteroom. There I convinced myself that this would be a quick handshake, a stern few sentences on what I was to do while I was there, a slap on the back, and a go-get-'em tiger. Well, Colonel Mattis called for me. He stood to greet me, offered to get me coffee, put a hand on my shoulder, put a hand on my shoulder, gave me, over my protestations, his own seat behind his desk, pulled up a chair to the side, actually took the phone off the hook, something I thought was just a figure of speech, closed the office door, and spent more than an hour knee to knee talking with me. He goes on to relate some of the events in the 2 Gulf Wars and how all this related to Mad Dog. He also makes mention of his treatment of those he is fighting against. He doesn't really want to capture anybody. If they're willing to put their weapons down, that's fine. If not, pretty much just run over them. Not literally, but just keep moving. Don't get bogged down. But in this conversation, the issue of waterboarding came up. Now, you got to keep in mind, waterboarding is not as horrific as burning people alive for not wearing the proper headgear. It's not as horrific as blowing up office buildings in New York with jet-fueled airliner, forcing people to jump out of windows 100 floors in the air in a vain hope of surviving that inferno. But horrific in the sense that the victims of this tactic believe they're going to drown. And I suppose some of them have, although that's not the point. And efforts are made to see that it doesn't happen. But now we have reports, more reports that keep coming out of the Middle East about those days and about the things that are going on. Mad Dog was there. I don't know if he waterboarded anybody. That was usually the purview of people in the... It wasn't dog soldiers. But there was one character that they picked up in all of this fighting They refer to him as KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And in the midst of all of this conversation about Mad Dog, reports are starting to drift out. This is the man who masterminded the Twin Tower attack, and he was submitted to this form of interrogation. Now, the Washington Post, and writer by the name of Thiessen, outlines what happened when KSM started talking. The account is from a first-hand observer. And speaking of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the author says, quote, "Then he looked at me and said, 'How was I supposed to know that cowboy George Bush would announce he wanted us dead or alive and then invade Afghanistan to hunt us down?' He went on to explain that if the United States had treated 9/11 like a law enforcement matter, we would have had time to launch a second wave of attacks. He was not able to do so because Al-Qaeda was stunned by the ferocity and swiftness of George W. Bush's response." And KSM said something else that was prophetic. He said, in the end, he said, "We will win, because Americans don't realize we don't need to defeat you militarily. We only need to fight long enough for you to defeat yourself by quitting." He went on to say Muhammad also predicted jihad-minded brothers would immigrate to the United States and take advantage of the country's rights and laws until they were ready to go on the attack. Now keep in mind, Muhammad died 600 years before Columbus ever sailed the blue. So I don't think he said this about the United States, but he probably said it about the world. This is why we need a Mad Dog Mattis. We don't need the guys in there now that are pussyfooting around and playing politics and trying to figure out how do we win this without it breaking anything. No, we need somebody that the rest of the world fears. And I think they think the Donald is a little unsteady, and I don't think they have any misgivings about what the Mad Dog will do if he's ever turned loose. I'm encouraged. Global warming got back on the burner again this week. What do you know about global warming? Well, if you're a liberal, you believe Al Gore. If you're not, well, then you probably have some doubts. Here's some recent statistics. Global land temperatures apparently have plummeted by just 1 degree Celsius since the middle of the year 2016. And that's the biggest and steepest decline on record. Can you hear the crickets chirping? When the temperatures shoot up, it's catastrophic climate change, which requires dramatic headlines across a mainstream media that demands urgent action. But when they fall, even more precipitously than they're rising, it's just a case of, I don't know, nothing here to see. The cause of the fall is an La Nina event following in the wake of an unusually strong El Nino. I don't know what any of that means, but there's an ebb and a flow of weather patterns over time. I talked to a fellow this week who is working at the National Weather Service here in Charleston. He works out at the airport. And I talked to him about some of this stuff, and I mentioned El Nino. And he just shook his head. He said, yeah. He said that kind of tells us what our weather's going to be like. It's just the natural way of things. Nothing to see here, people. Over in the Middle East, President Obama took a pass at enacting a congressional order to move the embassy in Israel to Tel Aviv, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem again. The waiver allowed for national security has been used by every president since the act was passed in 1995 by Congress, telling Congress they could move and they should move to Jerusalem. Every president to date has stalled on it. Obama's no exception. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has vowed to move the embassy once he takes office. Skeptics are not so sure. They say he likes to say a lot of things that never come true. But keep your eye on the eastern horizon, because if Trump actually does this, there will definitely be a reaction. Over in Syria, in the Middle East, as if the Palestinian issue was not enough, there are now daily attacks from civilians. There's a wall surrounding all of central Israel. There's sophisticated equipment to detect and to destroy tunnels. And there's a constant pressure from the north. That means Syria. The effort in Syria is confusing. It's also very dangerous. And that's because there are several factions involved, not all of whom are clear on what they're doing, including us. The militant Islamic groups want the president of Syria to go. Turkey wants the president of Syria to go. Is that right? Maybe I thought he wanted him to stay. Doesn't make sense. The Obama administration wanted him gone. And the United States has been working through radical and savage Islamic rebels to arm them in their effort to overthrow the Syrian government. Can you say Benghazi? But now that Russia's involved in saving Assad, yeah, I knew that was wrong. It's a mistype. That's a thing. Russia's there to save him. The things actually are getting tricky. Can we help the radical Islamic terrorists in Syria and not upset Russia? Can we stop and still see our interests preserved? And why are we helping terrorists in Syria while we're fighting them in Iraq? Can you say coherent strategy? In the midst of all this, Israel's stepping up air and ground bombardments in Syria to protect their northern frontier. Nobody knows how long Syria is going to tolerate this. The Turkish President Erdogan was at a conference there in Turkey this past week. He was talking about the Temple Mount. Pressure apparently is mounting among religious Jews for an Israeli presence on the Temple Mount. Islamic forces are dead set against this. Clashes and arrests are almost an everyday event. Speaking at the Symposium of Jerusalem platform in Istanbul, President Erdogan insists Israel is restricting Muslim worship. He referred specifically to the proposed Israeli legislation to limit the volume and the hours of the Muslims' call to prayer, calling it dangerous. You do realize they do this 5 times a day. He said this practice is offensive not only for Palestinians but for all Muslims. We have communicated with the Israeli officials our concerns on the kind of dangerous consequences this might have if such a bill is enacted. Erdogan also threatened that the region, quote, will not find peace until the wound in the Middle East is treated. You know what the wound is, right? It's the presence of Israel, of Israelis. They're the wound. He called for an independent, sovereign Palestinian state with the capital, East Jerusalem, based on the borders of 1967 as the only way to achieve lasting peace in the Middle East. His comments came as Israel and Turkey prepared to exchange ambassadors as part of a reconciliation deal to end years of hostility. Can you say tricky? Strange? That's the Middle East. We just had a major sale weekend. We call it Black Friday. I guess we have, what do we call Saturday? But according to NBC News, Black Friday brought more than stampedes to the TV stores and to the extra stuff that we get at that time. You know, I got grandchildren who used to get up 3 o'clock in the morning to get to the store, stand in line, got to get in take all that money in your pocket and give it to these big corporations. They love it. Black Friday was a success again, but reports also say that the post-Thanksgiving shopping spiked background checks for firearms to record numbers. FBI spokesman Stephen Fisher told NBC News that this year the National Instant Criminal Background Check System processed 185,713 transactions the day after Thanksgiving. That breaks the FBI's forecast of approximately 180,000, and it also breaks last year's record of 345,000. That's an increase of 0.2% on one day. Now, a background check doesn't necessarily mean a firearm was purchased. Of course, this also doesn't mean just one firearm was purchased. With discounts on guns, it's possible that multiples were purchased as gifts, as well as those sold to collectors attempting to take advantage of the deals. An even more interesting tidbit of information comes from Kathy at the blog entitled Pesky Truth. She says the number breaks down to slightly more than 2 background checks per second, or enough firearms to arm each of the 182,000 active duty members of the United States Marines. And she finishes with Semper Fi.